Imagine risking your life for your country, only to return home and be told you're not even worthy of a cup of coffee. Justice wasn't blind, it was selective. And what they did to Elijah will leave you furious. The steam hissed as the train screeched to a stop, sending a plume of gray smoke curling through the sticky Alabama air. July 1920. The station was no more than a wooden platform and a rusted bench. But to Elijah Thompson, it might as well have been a battlefield. He stepped off the train slowly, boots hitting the ground with the weight of memories. And something heavier. He adjusted the collar of his faded army uniform, creased, sun-bleached, and far too tight across his chest now, but he wore it with pride. A quiet kind of pride. Not the kind that paraded down avenues with banners and cheers. No, this was the kind forged in trenches, laced with mud, blood, and the silence of men who never made it home. Elijah had made it home. At least, that's what the conductor said. Montgomery Station, the man barked. End of the line. But home didn't feel like home anymore. No one welcomed him, no band, no flag. Just two old men on the bench, who looked away the moment they saw the color of his skin and the uniform he wore. A Negro soldier was a contradiction they couldn't process. He was supposed to pick cotton, not pick up a rifle, not die for a country that refused to seat him at a lunch counter. Elijah felt the familiar burn rise in his chest, but he swallowed it, just like he had in France. He looked around. The town hadn't changed much. Same cobbled sidewalks. Same church bell that tolled each Sunday morning like a judgment. But new signs had gone up while he was gone. Whites only, no exceptions, colored restroom. Back alley, no dogs, no Negros, no excuses. They weren't signs, they were scars. And Elijah could feel each one reopen wounds he thought had healed overseas. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sketch, a drawing he'd made in a foxhole one night, lit only by the flicker of mortar fire. It was a small shop with a crooked door and a sign above that read, "For all." It was simple, a café, a place to read, sip coffee, maybe hear a little music, a place where no one asked where your people came from, just whether you took cream or sugar. That dream had kept him alive. Even when bullets ripped through the mud around him, even when he buried his best friend with trembling hands and closed his eyelids with a prayer. That sketch was hope. It was his war medal, his act of resistance. Now, standing at the edge of Montgomery's segregated heart, he wondered if it had been foolish. If he had been foolish. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "You need a ride, soldier." He turned. A black man in overalls stood beside a rickety truck, nodding toward the back. Elijah nodded, too tired to speak. He climbed in, the uniform drawing stares from white passers-by and cautious admiration from others like him, those who carried the burden of survival quietly. As the truck rolled through the dusty streets, Elijah watched a group of white children playing outside an ice cream parlor. A colored boy peeked around the corner, watching. He didn't dare step closer. That's when Elijah made his decision. He leaned forward, voice low but steady. "You know anyone renting space near the library?" The driver raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "A café," Elijah said. "And a bookstore." The driver gave a low whistle, half disbelief, half respect. "That's a dangerous kind of dream around here." Elijah didn't flinch. "I've seen worse than danger. I've seen war." The truck kept rolling, wheels grinding against the gravel. But in that moment, something shifted. Elijah wasn't just returning. He was stepping into another kind of battlefield. And this time, he wasn't carrying a gun. He was carrying a vision. The shop opened quietly. No grand sign, no ribbon cutting, no headlines in the Montgomery Advertiser. Just a hand-painted wooden board that read, "For all books and brew," hung slightly crooked, just the way Elijah liked it. It was imperfect, human like everything else in the world that was worth loving. Inside, the air smelled like old pages, fresh paint, and cinnamon. The bookshelves were built by hand. From reclaimed pine wood Elijah hauled in himself. The counter was second-hand, sanded smooth and polished until it gleamed like the hope that had carried him through the war. In one corner, an upright piano leaned slightly to the left, waiting for someone to make it sing again. The smell of roasted coffee beans floated through the air, and behind the counter stood Elijah, wearing a clean shirt, apron tied tight, and a look in his eyes that said, "I dare you to dream with me." He didn't expect a crowd. He knew better than that. This wasn't Harlem. This was Alabama, deep and slow and careful. Still, he hoped anyone might walk in. The first to arrive were two older men from the church, Mr. Henry and Deacon Lewis. They didn't order anything, just looked around, nodded respectfully, and left with a murmured, "Be careful, son." Later that afternoon, a young colored girl wandered in, no more than 10. Her hair tied in ribbons. She didn't speak, just walked to the bookshelf marked fairy tales and sat cross-legged on the floor. Elijah let her be. For 20 minutes, the only sounds were the ticking of the wall clock and the rustle of a turning page. He smiled. That was enough. Until the bell above the door jingled again, and in walked trouble, in the form of a 12-year-old white boy with a mop of blonde hair and scuffed boots. Elijah froze. The room changed instantly, like someone had sucked the air out through the floorboards. Even the little girl glanced up, eyes wide, unsure if she was still allowed to breathe. The boy, oblivious, or maybe just bold, looked around and walked right up to the counter. "Smells good in here," he said. Elijah stared at him. "You lost?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir. I followed the smell." "Is that cinnamon?" Elijah hesitated. This was exactly the kind of situation that got people lynched. And not just people, him. Still, he kept his voice calm. "It's cocoa, with a little cinnamon and clove." The boy's eyes lit up. "Can I get a cup?" Elijah stared at him for a long beat. The air hung heavy. The girl with the ribbons put her book down quietly and stood up, as if ready to run. But then Elijah exhaled slowly and reached for a mug. "You got a name?" he asked. "Tommy," the boy grinned. "Tommy Jenkins." Elijah's hand paused mid-pour. "Jenkins, as in Sheriff Jenkins?" He said nothing, just handed over the cup. Tommy took a careful sip, and his eyes widened. "That's real good," he said. "Not like the kind we get at church. That one tastes like ash." Elijah smiled despite himself. "Glad you think so." Tommy looked around, stepping over to the bookshelf near the piano. "You got books too?" "Plenty. Even for kids, especially for kids." Tommy picked up The Wind in the Willows, sat on the floor, and started reading like he belonged there. Elijah didn't stop him. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The bell jingled again. This time it was Miss S. Jackson from the bakery down the street. She stepped in, took one look at Tommy, and gasped. "Elijah," she whispered, "what in God's name are you doing?" He met her eyes, calm and unshaken. "Serving cocoa." She shook her head. "You need to shut this place down, now, before someone else does it for you." He didn't respond, just poured another cup and offered it to her. She didn't take it. She left. By sundown, word had spread like wildfire. A Negro man had served a white boy cocoa and let him read fairy tales under the same roof as a colored girl. Some folks called it brave, most called it foolish. But Tommy came back the next day, and the next, and the day after that. Sometimes he brought a nickel, sometimes just stories. He told Elijah about his dog, Rufus, and how his mom didn't like loud thunder. He told him his dad was real important but real mad most of the time. And Elijah listened, because no one else was. But on the 5th day, trouble came. 3 white men, hats pulled low, shoulders stiff. They stood in front of the café, staring through the glass like they were reading a crime scene. Inside, Elijah was wiping down the counter. Tommy was at his usual spot with Treasure Island. The little girl was gone. Her mother had pulled her out the day before. One of the men spit on the ground. Another cracked his knuckles. The third, tall and silent, turned and walked off without a word. Elijah watched them go, and then kept wiping the counter. That evening, Tommy stood to leave. He pulled something from his pocket, a silver coin, and placed it on the counter. "It's not for the cocoa," he said. Elijah looked down. It was a $1 coin, worn at the edges, but polished like someone had cared for it a long time. "My mom said it was my granddaddy's," Tommy added. "Said he gave it to her the day she got married. I think he'd want you to have it." Elijah didn't know what to say. Tommy just smiled. "See ya tomorrow." And he was gone. Elijah stared at the coin long after the door closed. The cafe was quiet again, but something had shifted. The war Elijah thought he'd left behind was just beginning. It was the silence that warned him. Montgomery's mornings were never truly quiet. Roosters crowed. Children argued on the way to school. The distant rattle of wagons and early automobiles echoed down cracked streets. But that morning, the air sat still. Even the birds seemed to hush. Elijah was pouring the first pot of cocoa when he noticed it. No footsteps. No whispers outside the café. No curious faces peeking in. Just nothing. He glanced at the door. The sign still read for all. His books stood neatly on the shelves. The piano hadn't been touched since the little girl stopped coming. And the silver coin, Tommy's coin, still rested on the shelf above the register, polished to a soft gleam. He knew. Before the knock came, he knew. It was 8:17 a.m. when the bell over the door didn't jingle, but the window beside it shook. 3 hard raps, like a judge's gavel. Elijah didn't flinch. He walked slowly, deliberately, and opened the door. Outside stood Sheriff Walter Klein, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, boots polished like mirrors, and rage simmering beneath a too-tight badge. Behind him were 2 deputies, one chewing tobacco, the other staring at the cracks in the pavement like he wanted to disappear. "Mr. Thompson," the sheriff said, removing his hat with exaggerated civility. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't move. "We've received reports." The sheriff's voice curled like smoke, polite on the surface, venom just beneath. "About a violation of local order." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Serving cocoa?" The sheriff smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Serving cocoa to white children, in the company of coloreds, in an establishment that was never meant to exist in the first place." "You mean one not built on hate?" Elijah asked. That smile vanished. Without warning, the sheriff stepped forward and backhanded the silver coin from the shelf. It clattered to the floor, spinning violently, before rolling to a stop at Elijah's boot. "You don't speak to me like that, boy." It wasn't the first time Elijah had been called boy, but it never got easier. He bent down slowly, picked up the coin, and placed it back in its spot. His hands were steady. The sheriff's voice dropped lower. "You know whose boy that is you've been serving?" Elijah nodded. "Tommy Jenkins, your son." That moment stretched between them like a tightrope over fire. Sheriff Klein's jaw flexed. His hand twitched toward his belt, but he didn't pull. Instead, he leaned in, close enough that Elijah could smell the tobacco and bourbon on his breath. "You think this little war of yours makes you a man? You think wearing that uniform, pouring hot drinks, reading books, makes you equal?" He spat the word like it burned his tongue. "You don't belong in this town. You don't belong in this world." Elijah didn't blink. "That's funny. I bled for it." The sheriff stepped back and nodded to the deputies. "Shut it down." The chewing deputy looked unsure. "Sir," one said, "shut it down." They moved in, knocked over chairs, swept books from the shelves. The cocoa pot shattered on the floor, staining the wood like blood. One of them took a bat to the piano. 3 notes rang out before silence swallowed them forever. Elijah didn't resist, didn't fight. He just stood there, eyes locked with the sheriff, who watched it all like a man demolishing something sacred slowly, methodically, with pleasure. When the damage was done, Sheriff Klein stepped forward again. "You've got until sundown to leave town, Thompson. If I see your face tomorrow, there won't be any more talking." He turned, boots crunching over broken porcelain and pages torn from children's books. The door slammed behind them. Elijah stood in the wreckage, chest rising and falling, not from fear, not even from rage, but from something deeper, something ancient, a grief older than bones. The next day, no one came, not even Tommy. The cafe sat silent, books gone, chairs broken, cocoa stains still fresh. But Elijah was there. He sat at the counter, hands folded, staring at the wall like it might offer answers. The silver coin was still in its place, the only thing untouched. The day after that, Annie returned. She had been away, caring for her sick mother 2 towns over. Elijah hadn't told her, hadn't wanted to worry her. She stepped through the ruined door, eyes wide. She took it all in, then looked at her husband. "Elijah." Her voice cracked. He didn't look at her. "I told them it was just cocoa." "But it's never just cocoa." She walked toward him, placed a hand on his shoulder. He reached into his pocket, and pulled out the sketch, the same one he drew in a foxhole in France. It was crumpled now, edges torn, but the words were still legible. For all. Annie took it, unfolded it slowly. Then she whispered, "We're not done." He looked up at her, startled. She met his gaze, firm, unwavering. "You're not the only one who's fought for something." Outside, the sun dipped low, and though the town thought they had shattered the café, they had only sharpened its purpose. The nights were longest, after a building has been emptied of dreams. The broken chairs, the stained floorboards, the shattered piano, they all remained exactly where Sheriff Klein's men had left them. But inside the café, something had changed. The space was no longer hollow. It pulsed with defiance, and Annie Thompson was its heartbeat. Every morning, she opened the doors not to serve drinks or sell books, but to remind the town that they were still here. She swept the floor, arranged the broken spines of children's books, like relics in a museum of resistance, and placed a single candle in the center of the counter. Not one person crossed the threshold. Not yet. But they watched. Men in suits walked by without speaking. Women clutched their purses tighter as they passed. Black children glanced over their shoulders. Some whispered, others stared in awe at the woman who dared to keep a dream alive. Inside, Annie moved with quiet grace. She polished the countertop until it gleamed again. She gathered the torn pages into bundles and placed them beside the window. She played 3 notes on the broken piano, the only keys that still worked. 3 notes, every day. And then she lit a candle. One afternoon, Elijah sat alone at the back of the shop, staring at nothing, listening to the creak of the ceiling fan overhead. His body ached, not from bruises but from weariness, the kind that creeps into your spirit and begs you to stop believing. In his hand was the same sketch from France, the paper now soft from the oils in his fingers, edges smoothed by time and trembling, but the words hadn't faded for all. He closed his eyes, and then he was back there. The trench was mud and rain and fear. France, 1918. Explosions cracked the sky open in the distance. Somewhere behind the ridge, screams cut through the air like shattered glass. Elijah crouched low, gripping his rifle, his uniform soaked and stiff with dirt and blood. Beside him, Sergeant Whitmore, a white officer from Georgia, clutched his leg, teeth clenched against the pain of a bullet wound. He was bleeding out, fast. "Leave me," Whitmore gasped. "You ain't making it out if you carry me." Elijah didn't answer. He just slung the rifle across his back, heaved the sergeant onto his shoulder, and started moving. Each step was a curse. Shells rained from the sky. Mud pulled at his boots like fingers trying to drag him under. "God damn it, Thompson," Whitmore groaned. "You're gonna get us both killed." Elijah didn't stop. The war wasn't fair. Neither was the world. But some things you didn't do for fairness. You did them because they were right. He got them both to the medical tent, and when they pulled Whitmore from his back, the doctors didn't thank him. They looked at him like he was a ghost who didn't belong. That night, Elijah sat alone outside the tent and drew a sketch, a shop, a piano, a bookshelf, a sign, for all. It was the first time he believed he might survive. Back in Montgomery, he sat motionless, eyes wet, jaw tight. Annie entered quietly. She had something in her hand, a sealed envelope, yellowed and worn. "What's that?" Elijah asked, voice hoarse. "It came in the mail this morning. No return address. Just your name." He took it with trembling fingers, broke the wax seal, and unfolded the pages inside. It was a letter, dated April 12, 1919, from Sergeant Charles Whitmore, to whom it may concern. If this letter finds its way to Elijah Thompson, then I pray it reaches a man who knows what courage is, because I saw it with my own eyes. I was dying in a trench outside Verdun when this man, this colored soldier, refused to leave me behind. He could have run. Every instinct told him to. But he chose humanity. He chose me. I survived that war because of him. And I came home with a debt that I've never been allowed to repay. This country sees men like Elijah as less than. That's its shame. But if there is any justice left in this land, let it begin with telling the truth. Elijah Thompson is the best man I've ever known. Sincerely, Charles Whitmore, U.S. Army. Elijah sat in silence, reading it over and over, the words digging into the walls he'd built around his soul. "Charles sent this?" he finally whispered. Annie nodded. "I think he tried, but someone made sure it didn't get to you. Until now." Elijah looked up at her. Why now? She didn't answer. But her eyes said what her voice didn't. Because someone's watching, and someone knows it's time. That night, they made a choice. They reprinted the letter, copied it by hand, hundreds of times. On the back, Annie wrote a single sentence in bold ink. "You call us dangerous. But what if the danger is the truth?" They placed them under doors, inside mailboxes, on church pews, and grocery counters. They slipped them into coat pockets, folded them into Bibles. Some were thrown away. Some were torn in half. But some were read. And for the first time, people began to whisper not about Elijah the troublemaker, but Elijah the war hero. A boy saved a man in a country that wouldn't even let him sit at the same table. And that man lived to tell the truth. The next morning, someone left a book on the front steps of the café. It was The Wind in the Willows. Inside the cover, in a child's handwriting, were 5 words: "I believe in for all. No name, just belief." Morning broke heavy with clouds. The sun struggled behind a layer of dull gray, casting Montgomery in a pale wash of uncertainty. But inside the ruined café, a single light flickered steady, defiant. Annie was already there. Elijah arrived just after 6, his jacket pulled tight against the morning chill. In his hands he carried a new sign, handmade again, painted with care. This one, though, didn't say for all. It was simpler, more pointed. 1 cup, 1 voice. He held it out to Annie. She took it, ran her fingers over the grooves in the wood, and nodded. "We hang it today," she said. No hesitation. They stepped outside together and mounted the sign above the fractured doorway. Hammer, nail, determination. Across the street, the butcher watched from behind his blinds. Next door, the hairdresser peeked through the slats. Down the road, a busboy stopped sweeping and simply stared. The Thompsons had not closed. They had not fled. They had stayed. Inside, the space was still bruised scars on the floor, piano keys missing, books worn and torn, but the candle still burned, the chairs were upright again, and that silver coin still gleamed from its perch above the counter. Elijah stood behind the counter like he used to. Annie brewed a fresh pot of cocoa. It filled the room with warmth that defied the cold weight pressing down from outside. But no one came in. An hour passed, then 2, and then the first knock. Elijah turned sharply, but it wasn't the sheriff. It was Miss S. Avery, the preacher's wife. She stood at the threshold, holding a worn porcelain mug in both hands. She didn't speak. She just walked in, placed the mug on the counter, and sat down in the corner silent. 5 minutes later, Deacon Lewis entered. He carried no cup, only a folded newspaper and a look of deep, heavy resolve. Then came Mr. Henry from the hardware store. And then, a flood. Not a crowd, not a rush. But one by one, black residents of Montgomery walked through the door of the broken cafe. Many brought their own cups. Tin, porcelain, clay. A few brought nothing at all. None of them asked for cocoa. They sat, they waited, in complete silence. It was a sit-in without speeches, a protest without signs. It was reverence. It was resistance. By noon, 27 people filled the space. Elijah stood frozen behind the counter, unsure what to do. Then Annie whispered, "Pour it." He nodded. One by one, he served. No payment, no menu, just cocoa in mismatched mugs. Every hand that received it said thank you, not aloud, but with eyes, with posture, with breath that finally came easy. Outside, white men gathered. Some cursed, some laughed, some stood stiff with disgust. And then, just as the tension began to thicken, he arrived. Sheriff Walter Klein. Tommy wasn't with him. This time, he didn't bring deputies. Just his presence was enough. He walked straight up to the cafe door but didn't enter. He didn't need to. His voice carried. "Well, ain't this something?" he drawled. "You really gonna serve the whole goddamn colored district, Thompson?" Elijah stepped to the doorway, cocoa in hand. "No, Sheriff. I'm not serving anyone. I'm inviting them." Sheriff Klein's eyes narrowed. "You think this changes anything? A few mugs and broken books? You're just giving these people false hope. Annie's voice cut in sharp. Hope's not false. Just inconvenient for men like you. A murmur rippled through the cafe. Klein's face twitched. Just slightly. Enough to reveal the anger he usually kept behind badge and belt. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold by an inch. Let me make this clear. You've been warned. You've been told. You're defying the law. Elijah locked eyes with him. I've obeyed the law. It's the law that refuses to obey justice. A pause. Long, tense. Klein reached toward his belt, just resting his hand there. Everyone held their breath. And then, a voice rang out from behind the crowd. Sheriff. It was Tommy, out of breath, red-faced, and holding something in his hand. He ran past the spectators, past the murmuring adults, and stopped between his father and Elijah. Klein glared. What the hell are you doing here, boy? Tommy didn't back down. He held up the item in his hand, a small, battered book. Treasure Island. Elijah gave me this, Tommy said. He made me feel like I mattered. Klein's face burned. Get away from him, now. But Tommy didn't move. He turned to Elijah, his voice cracking with urgency. I'm sorry I didn't come back sooner. Mama said we were leaving town. Said it was dangerous. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small white envelope. Elijah, my daddy got a letter. From a man named Whitmore. He tore it up. But I taped it back. I think it was meant for you. He handed it over, then took a step back. Elijah opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, creased, stained, but legible. It was the original letter from Whitmore, dated months earlier than the copy Elijah had received. And at the bottom, in faint pencil, were words not included in the later version. If anything happens to me, tell the boy. Let him know who Elijah really is. Tommy's hands trembled. That's why I came. The crowd was silent. Even the sheriff said nothing. For the first time, Elijah saw something flicker in Klein's eyes. Not fear, not regret, something else, something hollow. He turned without a word and walked away. That night, Annie and Elijah stood behind the counter long after the last guest left. The silver coin still sat where it always had, but now, beside it, lay a new treasure, a boy's book, and a letter meant to be hidden. Annie lit the candle. 3 notes from the broken piano rang out again, and this time, they sounded like something else entirely. A beginning. The following morning, the sun broke through the clouds like a secret finally spoken. Its rays spilled through the cracked window panes of Books and Brew, casting soft light onto the dust still clinging to shelves and floorboards. The cafe wasn't perfect. It never had been, but it stood. And that, in itself, was a kind of miracle. Word had spread. Not through headlines, no paper dared print what was happening at 6th and Jefferson, but in whispers at church, behind closed doors at the barber shop, over careful conversations at supper tables. Something was shifting. People who had never dared speak Elijah Thompson's name aloud now leaned in closer when it came up. Some with admiration, some with worry, some with a fear that looked an awful lot like guilt. But the biggest shift came at exactly 9:04 a.m. The cafe bell jingled softly. Elijah looked up from behind the counter, half expecting another neighbor with a quiet mug or a silent nod. Instead, a tall white man in a gray coat stepped through the doorway. His shoes were polished. His hair swept back with military precision, and though the years had added lines to his face and silver to his temples, Elijah knew him the moment their eyes met. Charles Whitmore, the trench, the screaming, the blood. The weight of a dying man across Elijah's shoulders, it all came rushing back. Whitmore removed his hat and nodded politely to Annie, who had frozen mid-step with a tray in her hand. Then he turned to Elijah. You still take sugar in your cocoa? He asked. Elijah's throat tightened. I didn't think you'd come. Whitmore stepped closer. I didn't think I could. But then my son told me you were still fighting. Elijah blinked. Your son? Whitmore smiled faintly. The post office clerk, quiet boy, grew up hearing his daddy talk about a soldier who saved him in a foreign land and got forgotten on home soil. Elijah gestured to a stool at the counter. You came all this way for cocoa? Whitmore sat. No, I came to tell the truth. And not on paper this time. Annie poured 2 mugs. Neither man spoke until the first sip. Then Whitmore leaned forward. I tried, Elijah. When I came back from the war, I wrote letters to newspapers, to officials, even to the VA. Every time I used your name, the letters disappeared. I sent one to the mayor's office. Heard later it got lost in filing. Another to the courthouse. A friend told me it was tossed in the fire before noon. He paused. They didn't just ignore your service. They buried it. Elijah stared into his cup. I figured, he said quietly, but I still hoped. Whitmore nodded slowly. I came today to say it in front of witnesses. He looked around. A few townsfolk had begun trickling in. Mr. Henry, the preacher's wife. 2 young boys with wide eyes and empty mugs. I owe my life to this man, Whitmore said, louder now, and this town owes him the right to exist without fear. If any man here questions that he can question me. The room was silent, and then someone clapped. It was Deacon Lewis, standing tall in the back. One clap, then another. Soon, the whole room joined. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, but it was real. Whitmore smiled, though his eyes were glassy. I'll be in town for a few days. I want to help, any way I can. Elijah reached across the counter and shook his hand. In that moment, 2 men, one black, one white, one soldier and superior sat as equals in a place built on that very idea. But Montgomery wasn't done testing them. Later that evening, a rumble echoed outside the café. Elijah stepped out to find a crowd gathering across the street. Not like the ones who came for cocoa. This one was louder, angry, white men with red faces, clenched fists, and spit on their lips. Some held signs. Segregation is safety. We know what you're doing. Whites first, always. And at the center of it all stood Sheriff Walter Klein. But this time, he didn't wear his uniform. He wore a black coat. No badge, no gun on his hip, just rage. See what you've done, Thompson? He shouted. You've turned this town into a circus. You're parading your so-called war stories, poisoning the minds of our youth, my own son. Elijah didn't flinch, but the crowd took a step forward. Klein raised his hand, and they paused. Then he pointed across the street to the café. You're not just breaking the law anymore. You're dividing this town, and I won't let it happen. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat, held it up, a formal petition, signed by 87 residents of Montgomery, demanding the closure of this establishment for inciting disorder. A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Whitmore stepped out beside Elijah. And how many of those signatures were given under threat? Walter. Klein turned. You stay out of this. You're not from here. Whitmore smirked. No, I'm from Georgia, a place where cowards hide behind petitions because they can't silence truth. Klein stepped forward, eyes full of fire. Watch yourself, Sergeant. Elijah raised a hand, calm, steady. You can wave your papers, you can stir your mobs, but this cafe isn't closing. You sure about that? I'm damn sure, Elijah said, because the door is open now, and it's not just open for cocoa, it's open for memory, for justice, and for reckoning. The wind picked up. The sign above the door creaked, but held. One cup, one voice. The mob didn't move, neither did Elijah. And in that suspended moment, something cracked. Not wood, not glass, but something deeper. And it wasn't inside the cafe. It was across the street. In the hearts of those who had spent a lifetime believing fear was power. Part 7, open ending approximately. 1,000 words title, The Door That Wouldn't Close. The crowd stood frozen, caught between history and change. On one side of the street, Elijah, Annie, Whitmore, and a modest cafe bruised by fire, boots, and silence, but still standing. On the other, Sheriff Walter Klein and 87 signatures behind a petition that weighed less than the truth. The town held its breath, and then, without warning, a sound soft at first, then spreading, broke the stillness. Footsteps. A small figure moved through the crowd, parting the angry mass like a ripple in water. Tommy Jenkins. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not with that many men shouting. Not with his father at the front of the mob. But there he was, dirty sneakers, canvas backpack, eyes wide with something between fear and resolve. He walked right past his father without a word, walked up the cracked steps of Books and Brew, and stepped inside. A hush fell. Klein's face turned red. Tommy, get back here. Tommy didn't turn. Instead, He reached into his backpack and pulled out his cup. The same one Elijah had served Coco in the very first time. He placed it gently on the counter. "I'd like a refill," he said. Elijah blinked. "You sure?" Tommy nodded. "You said this place was for everyone. I believe that." Annie smiled, tears in her eyes. She took the mug and started pouring. That's when the second shift happened. A teenage girl crossed the street, then an older man with a cane, then two boys still wearing their school jackets. Each walked into the cafe, slow but certain. Not a word spoken, just a presence. They didn't all sit together. Some leaned on walls, some sat on the floor, some brought nothing but themselves. But they came, and the cafe got full again. Not in numbers, in meaning. Outside, the mob began to splinter. Some men looked around and realized their neighbors were gone. Some shifted uncomfortably, not quite sure why their fists were still clenched. Sheriff Klein, still standing, clenched the petition tighter. "You think a few cups of cocoa change anything?" he growled. Whitmore stepped down the steps. "No, but truth does. And this town has ignored it for too long." Klein shook his head, like a man watching a world he couldn't stop from changing. He looked at Elijah, at Annie, at Tommy, and then he walked away. No speech, no threat, just the sound of boots on gravel. Inside, Elijah leaned on the counter, exhaling slowly. "It's not over," he said quietly. Annie placed a hand on his. "No, but it's begun." Tommy took a sip. "Still tastes better than church cocoa." That made everyone laugh, even Elijah, even now. As evening fell, the light through the cafe windows turned golden soft, forgiving. Whitmore sat by the piano, tapping the 3 surviving keys gently. Plink, plink, pause, plink. A broken melody, but still music. Annie lit the candle. Elijah reached for the letter from Whitmore, the original one, and placed it beside the silver coin. Then, from under the counter, he pulled a new object. A ledger, blank pages. He opened it, took a pen, and on the first line wrote, "March 14, 1920, one boy believed. So did we." He looked up. "From now on," he said, "we write it ourselves, the stories, the names, the truth, so they don't get buried again." The room nodded. One by one, people stepped forward and signed, not a petition, a record of what mattered, of what was real. Later that night, as the town settled under its heavy southern sky, a gentle breeze blew through the cafe's broken doorframe. The new sign creaked, "One cup, one voice." And under it, Elijah added one more phrase carved into wood, "Raw and beautiful, whites only." Then in smaller, hand-painted letters, "Only if you believe in equality." He stepped back, hammer still in hand. Annie joined him. "It's not safe, you know." "I know," he said, "but it's right." She smiled. He looked out into the street and saw a man standing alone, not in the mob, not in the cafe, just watching. He was older, white, wore a hat pulled low. He said nothing, did nothing, just stared at the door, then took a step forward and stopped. Elijah watched him, waited. Would he enter? Would he turn away? The man lingered a moment more, then slowly removed his hat and walked up the steps. The door didn't close behind him, because it never had. Some doors don't stay open because they're wide. They stay open because someone refuses to close them. This wasn't just about cocoa. It was about courage. And in 1920, Alabama, courage tasted like cinnamon. If this story made you feel something, anger, sadness, or even hope, drop a number 1 in the comments so we know you're still out there, still listening, still caring. Because the truth is, injustice doesn't always come with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it comes with silence and a door that never opens. The lesson? Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just keeping the door open when the world is trying to slam it shut. Your comment might inspire someone else to finally step through that door.